Nia Brooks could feel the crisp morning air brush against her cheeks as she stepped onto the busy sidewalk outside Monarch International Airport in downtown Chicago. The sun had barely risen, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold. It was that fleeting hour when some travelers were just waking up from red-eye flights, while others, energized by coffee and excitement, hurried toward new adventures. She inhaled deeply, gathering her resolve, and clutched the leather handle of her carry-on. In a few hours, she would be on a flight to Washington, D.C., but not before a short, peaceful break in the first-class lounge of Ascendant Air. Before we dive into the heart of today's tale, take a moment to drop a like on this video, hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive and thriving. So show some love and let's build this incredible community together. Inside the terminal, bright overhead lights illuminated a sprawling labyrinth of ticket counters, security lines, shops, and restaurants. Automated announcements chimed periodically, updating people about boarding times and gate changes. The multitude of voices, both cheerful and stressed, mingled with the roar of rolling suitcases. Despite the brisk pace and the hustle of the crowd, Nia maneuvered with unhurried grace, her glossy black pumps clicking confidently against the polished floor. She was dressed in a chic blazer and trousers, paired with a subtle silk blouse. Although she disliked attracting attention, she radiated a composed elegance. "Good morning," said the airline agent at the Ascendant Air counter, offering Nia a warm, professional smile. "Flying first class to D.C.? Here's your boarding pass, Ms. Brooks. You can proceed to the Ascendant Lux Lounge if you'd like. Boarding should start in about an hour." Nia smiled back, collecting her boarding pass and ID. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Though her words were calm, her mind thrummed with anticipation. Only a handful of people knew that Nia Brooks had become a principal stakeholder in Ascendant Air through a series of strategic acquisitions over the past year. She had done so quietly, relying on holding companies to keep her name away from headlines. She wanted to prove her worth in the company before revealing her identity. Today's trip to D.C. was crucial. A round of negotiations awaited her, finalizing the pivot of Ascendant's future expansion, as well as upgrades for a more inclusive travel experience. Glancing around, Nia breathed in the energy of the airport. In the past, she had flown economy more times than she could count. She still remembered the cramped seats, the overhead bins stuffed to capacity, the lukewarm coffee, and the exhaustion that came from budget hopping between cities. Becoming wealthy was never her sole motivation. She had built her success on authenticity, discipline, and a desire to transform industries from within. Now that she had influence in Ascendant Air, her dream was to make flight experiences better for everyone, no matter their background. As Nia walked toward the escalator that led up to the Ascendant Lux Lounge, she mentally ran through her schedule for the day: a quick breakfast in the lounge, a final review of her digital presentation, and a few phone calls to confirm meeting times. She had a plan. Everything seemed perfectly aligned. Yet something in the pit of her stomach whispered that not all would go as smoothly as she hoped. On the other side of the massive terminal, Officer Dean Jacobs wandered through the concourse in plain clothes, dark slacks, and a button-up shirt that did nothing to hide his broad shoulders and firm posture. He was off-duty, traveling for a personal matter in Detroit. At first, he had no particular interest in the travelers around him, but as he neared the region with the airline lounges, his gaze settled on a tall woman with a refined aura, stepping onto the escalator that led to a members-only corridor. He paused, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Dean wasn't a stranger to high-end travel areas. In his years of service, he had occasionally guarded VIPs at airports for dignitary protection. Still, something about Nia Brooks piqued his attention. Perhaps it was her self-assured posture, or maybe the elegant, understated attire that hinted at wealth without shouting it. Then, almost unconsciously, doubt slithered into his mind. He noticed how her glistening suitcase and expensive tote looked impeccable, how her jewelry was classy yet minimal. He wanted to think it was professional interest, vigilance born from a decade of experience policing. But the truth loomed larger. A nagging instinct told him that a woman like her, young, black, and unaccompanied, did not seem like the typical first-class traveler he was used to imagining. Before he could stop himself, Dean found his feet guiding him to the escalator, maintaining a cautious distance behind Nia. Upstairs, the Ascendant Luxe Lounge welcomed Nia with soft lighting, plush leather chairs, and a quiet hush that offered a respite from the frenetic airport below. A smiling receptionist scanned her boarding pass, verified her membership eligibility, and waved her in. Soft music played in the background, and a buffet table featured fruit, pastries, yogurts, and an assortment of refreshments. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the runway, where jets taxied under the morning sun. Nia breathed out gently. She selected a secluded seat near the window, away from the few other travelers who lounged in comfortable chairs, browsing their phones. As she sank into the plush seat, her eyes fell upon the runway seen outside. The planes looked so serene, gliding toward their gates. After a quick mental reset, she powered up her tablet to review slides for a pivotal meeting. But first, she sipped a warm cappuccino, letting the rich foam soothe her. She reminded herself that the best accomplishments often arose from calm determination. Yet, she could not completely shake a tiny jolt of nerves. If all went well in D.C., she planned to hold a press conference sometime soon, finally revealing her position in Ascendant Air. Maybe it would be a big surprise to the corporate world. Maybe it would help open new doors for other aspiring business leaders. Outside the lounge's glass doors, Dean Jacobs hesitated. He didn't exactly have lounge access, and he wasn't wearing his uniform, just a badge tucked away in his wallet. Still, he approached the receptionist and gave a friendly nod. "Hi there," he said, attempting to keep his tone casual. "I'm Dean Jacobs, Chicago PD off-duty. Mind if I pop in and take a look around? Need to check on a passenger who might need assistance." The receptionist eyed him politely but inquisitively. Her training taught her to maintain a professional demeanor. "We typically only allow first-class passengers or members, sir. May I see your credentials and have a clearer explanation?" Dean flashed his badge, his posture tightening. "Just a quick look," he repeated. "I saw something that raised concern. It won't take long." Though she was a bit puzzled, the receptionist decided to step aside. Officers occasionally checked lounge areas for security reasons, after all. Without waiting for a second invitation, Dean walked inside. He scanned the room and soon caught sight of Nia, alone by the window, immersed in her notes. His suspicions hardened, but he told himself that he just needed to confirm everything was legitimate. Nia felt someone looming, sensed a presence in her periphery. When she looked up, she saw a tall man with a no-nonsense expression standing near her seat. Confusion flickered in her eyes. This was certainly not a lounge attendant. "Good morning," Dean said in a polite but guarded tone. Are you traveling alone?" Nia furrowed her brow. "I am, yes. Can I help you?" Dean cleared his throat. "I'm Officer Dean Jacobs, off-duty. I just saw you come in and wanted to be sure everything's okay." The intrusion unsettled her, but she strove for composure. "I'm fine. Just waiting for my flight in the lounge, like any other first-class passenger," she answered, her voice steady. Dean nodded stiffly, as though mentally checking off boxes. He noticed her tablet open to spreadsheets and slides, showing corporate data, but he couldn't interpret it quickly. "Right," he said, glancing around as if searching for something else. "I don't mean to bother you, but would you happen to have your boarding pass? I think the lounge might be restricted." Nia's heart rate kicked up. She felt an echo of every microaggression she'd endured throughout her life. But she kept calm. "The staff admitted me. I showed them my credentials." "Maybe so," Dean said, "but I'd like to see it personally." She hesitated. Who was this man to demand her boarding pass? If he was an actual officer, was he officially investigating something? Her instincts said this was anything but normal. Still, she rummaged through her tote and extracted the pass. Dean glanced at it, studying her name. "Ms. Nia Brooks, first class to Washington, D.C., Seat 2A, he murmured. "Kind of a pricey ticket." It was a backhanded remark. Nia's patience was wearing thin. "Is that so surprising?" she asked quietly, though her tone carried a steel edge. He handed the pass back, his face a swirl of mild uncertainty. "Look, I'm not accusing you of anything. We've had issues with people sneaking into places they shouldn't be or booking seats fraudulently. I just want to be sure there's no trouble." Nia pressed her lips together. "Officer Jacobs, the only trouble is you hovering over me right now. I paid for my seat. I'm here lawfully." Before Dean could reply, the lounge receptionist approached, apologizing for the interruption. "Ma'am, is everything all right? Officer, do you need something else?" Nia caught the woman's concerned gaze and shook her head. "No, everything's fine. I think I'll just head to my gate. Thank you." Without waiting for a response, she packed up her tablet and left. Dean watched her go, feeling an odd stab of guilt that he tried to dismiss. She was so composed, and he couldn't pinpoint any real reason for his suspicions, other than his gut instinct. Yet that gut instinct might have been shaped by bias more than he cared to admit. Down at the main concourse, Nia tried to quell her churning emotions. The memory of Dean's tone lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She knew she'd have to refocus on her upcoming meeting. But this was the first time she had encountered an officer so blatantly interrogating her simply for occupying the same luxurious space as others. Still, she refused to let it define her day. At Gate B17, a line had begun forming for first class and priority boarding. Nia took a seat near the window, double-checking her phone for messages. Her partner in DC had texted to confirm the day's agenda. That small reminder of her real mission buoyed her mood. She took a steadying breath. Soon, an Ascendant Air agent called first-class passengers to board. Nia stood, showed her pass, and walked gracefully down the jet bridge. She paused for a moment at the threshold of the plane, greeting the flight attendant who offered a broad smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Brooks," the attendant said, glancing at the boarding pass. "You're seated in 2A, just on the left. Would you like a pre-flight beverage?" Nia nodded appreciatively. "Water would be great, thank you." As she made her way to her seat, she noticed the cabin's serene atmosphere, spacious seats, large overhead bins, and a sense of calm. The stress from the lounge encounter began to evaporate, replaced by thoughts of the meeting that awaited her. She stowed her bag, settled in, and took the offered glass of water. Moments later, the disquiet returned when she saw Dean Jacobs boarding the plane as well. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe he was heading somewhere else or just passing through. But as the cabin door remained open for economy passengers, it became clear he was actually on this flight, though probably seated farther back. He walked past her row, meeting her eyes for just a second. There was something like embarrassment in his expression, but he proceeded without a word. Nia couldn't tell if he was truly ashamed or just doubling down on an imaginary threat. Regardless, she vowed not to let him tarnish her flight further. The pilot's voice soon crackled over the loudspeaker. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Ortega. We've got clear skies ahead for the flight to Washington, D.C., scheduled for just over an hour and a half. Please settle in, and we'll be pushing back shortly." Nia breathed a quiet sigh, fastening her seatbelt. She clicked through her presentation one last time on the tablet, making note of any final changes. This meeting could result in a sweeping transformation of Ascendant Air's approach, expanding into new markets, investing in emerging aviation technologies, and adopting inclusive hiring practices. The board members, upon learning of her significant stake, would need her vision to guide the next steps. In the end, she didn't just want more routes or bigger profits. She wanted a better experience for travelers of all backgrounds. Despite her attempts to remain calm, the flight's initial climb produced a wave of anxiety. She often found flying exhilarating, but sometimes the tension from the ground followed her aboard. It didn't help that she occasionally glanced toward the curtain separating first class from economy, half expecting Dean Jacobs to walk through. Half an hour into the flight, the seatbelt signs switched off, and the flight attendants offered a snack and beverage service. Nia politely asked for coffee, hoping the caffeine would help sharpen her focus. She sipped it slowly, forcing her mind back to the slides. Then it happened. She heard a voice from behind her seat, accompanied by a visible stir in the aisle. There was Dean talking to a flight attendant, pointing toward the front of the plane. The attendant, a young woman with a neat ponytail, looked perplexed, but tried to maintain a professional demeanor. Nia tensed. Her instincts screamed that this was about her. She set her coffee aside, bracing herself for the possibility of another confrontation. Moments later, the flight attendant came up to her row. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Brooks," she said in a hushed voice. "We have a passenger who claims he's concerned about your ticket. We've already verified it, but he insists on checking it again." A flush of anger rushed to Nia's face. She nodded curtly and handed over the boarding pass once more. The attendant scanned the pass with a handheld reader, confirming that all was valid. "Thank you," the attendant said softly. "I'll let him know there's no issue." Nia's heart pounded. She was grateful the attendant was discreet, but it didn't erase the knot forming in her stomach. The entire ordeal felt humiliating. More than that, it was infuriating that this off-duty officer couldn't drop his baseless suspicion. Other passengers started glancing in her direction. In tight quarters, drama rarely went unnoticed. Moments later, as the flight attendant explained to Dean that Ms. Brooks was indeed supposed to be there, Nia heard a sharp exchange of words. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, sternly told Dean to stop hassling her. Someone else muttered about racial profiling from behind a seat. Dean frowned, bristling with indignation. But faced with the flight attendant's firm stance and the disapproval of surrounding passengers, he had no choice but to retreat to the economy cabin. The ripple of tension gradually settled, and Nia exhaled, feeling both relief and frustration. The flight continued in uneasy silence. Nia tried, and mostly failed, to immerse herself in work for the remainder of the trip. By the time they landed in Washington, D.C., she had decided not to say another word to Dean Jacobs. If anything, she wanted to avoid him entirely. She collected her bag, thanked the flight crew, and exited the aircraft, ignoring the wave of fatigue pressing against her temples. She navigated the busy corridor toward baggage claim, ignoring the clamor of taxis and rideshare passengers outside. Her personal driver waited with a placard that read Brooks. She was relieved to see a friendly, familiar face. After handing over her carry-on for the trunk, she joined the swirl of people at the carousel. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Dean Jacobs again. He was loitering near another carousel, glancing her way. Her annoyance peaked, but she refused to engage. Instead, she focused on retrieving her checked luggage, then briskly followed her driver toward the exit. In the following days, Nia became engrossed in board meetings and negotiations. Ascended Air's top executives were impressed by her thoughtful blueprint for a new era of travel, one that encompassed environmental consciousness, advanced technology, and a renewed commitment to diversity. She felt a pulse of excitement each time her proposals got nods of approval. On the second evening of the conference, while finishing dinner with a few business partners, Nia's phone buzzed. A colleague had forwarded a trending social media video. Her eyes widened as she recognized the footage. Someone had recorded Dean Jacobs confronting her in first class and posted it online. The caption read, "Off-duty cop harasses black woman for flying first class. Turns out she's a major player at Ascendant Air." Nia's stomach sank. She had wanted to keep her identity private until she felt ready for a public reveal. Yet fate had decided otherwise. The video had racked up thousands of views, with strangers on the internet condemning Dean's actions and praising Nia for her calm demeanor. She scrolled through the comment section. Some people demanded the officer be held accountable. Others shared their own stories of profiling. Her name was now out in the open, along with speculation that she was either extremely wealthy or had ties to Ascendant Air's leadership. She pressed her palm against her temple, trying to quell the headache forming. The world never operated on her schedule. She wondered how the airline would handle the sudden wave of publicity. It didn't take long. By the next morning, she had emails from Ascendant Air's PR team, as well as from a few executives. They were all alarmed by the uproar. The police department back in Chicago had also become aware of the viral post, resulting in a preliminary inquiry into Officer Jacobs's off-duty conduct. While Nia was still sorting out how to respond, she learned that Ascendant Air had released a statement. "We do not tolerate harassment or discrimination of any passenger, and we take these concerns very seriously. We have reached out to Ms. Brooks to extend our full support. Ascendant Air is committed to ensuring safe and inclusive travel for every individual." Nia understood the significance of the moment. The board, now aware of her substantial stake in the airline, asked her to weigh in on the course of action. Should they push for legal measures against Dean Jacobs? Demand an apology? How should they handle the media? Despite her personal frustration, Nia wanted to approach this with a bigger picture in mind. A purely punitive route might punish one man, but would it spark meaningful change? In a private conversation with Ascendant's legal counsel, she explained her stance. "I don't need a personal apology for my own sake," she said, "but I want to address the broader issue. We should advocate for policies that minimize this kind of behavior in the future, not just in our airline, but in society at large." Amid the swirling media coverage, the Chicago Police Department opened a probe into Dean Jacobs' actions. They needed to determine whether his off-duty conduct violated ethical standards or department policies. The situation escalated quickly. Some news outlets carried the story under headlines like "Prominent Airline Executive Targeted by Officers Profiling." Others picked it up simply because the incident had gone viral, and controversies involving race and policing often dominated public discourse. Back in Chicago, Dean Jacobs felt his world tilt. His superiors called him in for a disciplinary hearing to discuss the matter. "It's all over the internet," one sergeant said grimly. "We can't ignore it. You need to give a statement." Dean's pride clashed with his growing sense of guilt. The more he replayed that morning in the lounge and on the plane, the clearer it became that he'd acted on an assumption. If asked point blank why he had singled out Ms. Brooks, he couldn't give a solid reason besides she looked out of place, which sounded pathetically flimsy and loaded with bias. He learned that Ascendant Air had lodged a formal complaint, accompanied by Nia's own account of the incident. Nothing had been filed in court, but there was enough pressure that the department had to act. Worried about losing his badge, or at least his reputation, Dean attempted to rationalize his behavior. "I was being vigilant. Lots of fraud out there." But each time, the words rang hollow. Meanwhile, Ascendant Air arranged a meeting to discuss the matter further, inviting a representative from the Chicago PD. They intended to handle the complaint with transparency and hear Dean's side of the story, though Nia's account and the viral footage were hard to dispute. Nia herself would be there, ready to weigh in. When Dean arrived at Ascendant Air's corporate office in downtown Chicago, he wore his uniform, thinking it might earn him an air of authority and respect. Little did he realize he was about to sit across from the airline's new power player, Ms. Nia Brooks. He found himself in a sleek conference room adorned with large windows that showcased the city skyline. A few Ascendant executives were already seated, reviewing documents. Then Nia entered in a tailored dress, her bearing calm yet undeniably assertive. Their eyes met, and Dean felt a wave of unease pass through him. She wasn't just a random passenger he'd harassed. She was a major force within Ascendant Air. "Officer Jacobs," she said, sitting down across from him. "Let's begin." A hush fell over the table. An Ascendant legal advisor cleared his throat, explaining the structure of the meeting. The company wanted to understand the off-duty officer's perspective, weigh any possible resolution, and decide on further action. Nia would provide her statement. The legal advisor would lay out the airline's concerns, and Dean would have a chance to respond. Dean swallowed, trying to muster confidence. "First, I'd like to apologize to Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice rigid. "I was overzealous. I believed I was doing my job, keeping an eye out for suspicious activity. In hindsight, I should have trusted the lounge staff and airline personnel." Nia listened without shifting her gaze. When he finished, she asked quietly, "What exactly was suspicious about me, Officer Jacobs?" He knew the question was inevitable. He hesitated. I saw a discrepancy in how you appeared versus the typical first-class passengers I'm used to seeing. That was wrong. I understand that now." "Do you realize the implications of that statement?" she pressed, her tone polite but unwavering. "You singled me out because I'm a black woman who had the means to be in first class." Dean felt his insides twist. He nodded, barely able to speak. The Ascendant legal advisor leaned in. "We have a duty to protect Ms. Brooks and all our passengers from harassment. The footage clearly shows repeated attempts on your part to question her status, even after flight attendants verified her seat. That goes beyond a misunderstanding." A couple of Ascendant executives chimed in, referencing the public fallout and how it tarnished the airline's image. They were also concerned about the personal distress it caused Nia. They explained that legal action was on the table. They could pursue it if they felt the matter warranted harsher measures. Nia, though, signaled for calm. "I'd like to propose an alternative approach," she said, glancing around the table. "This incident might be an opening for conversation and education rather than a punitive conclusion." Dean exhaled shakily. A glimmer of hope formed in his chest. She laid out a plan. "I don't need personal vengeance, but I do want to ensure that such bias-driven harassment doesn't continue. If the Chicago Police Department is open to it, I'd recommend a structured anti-bias training program for Officer Jacobs. I also want him to engage in community outreach, especially in underrepresented neighborhoods. People need to see that this kind of profiling has consequences, but that we can also reform and grow." The Ascendant executives nodded solemnly. One said, "We can make a strong statement about how we handle incidents like this. A purely legal route might backfire or become a long battle. Ms. Brooks has a point. We can champion real change if this is handled correctly." Dean's face tightened. It was humbling to have the fate of his reputation, and possibly his career, rest in the hands of the very person he'd wrongly targeted. He spoke carefully. "I'll do whatever it takes." "I'm sorry," he repeated, genuinely this time. With the broad strokes agreed upon, the meeting concluded. Ascendant Air would not file a lawsuit but remain firm. If Dean did not comply with these conditions, or if future reviews showed he hadn't improved, legal action could follow. The Chicago PD would observe the arrangement, and internal discipline might still apply. Standing outside the building afterward, Dean watched Nia Brooks slip into a waiting sedan. He realized she was still somewhat guarded. They hadn't parted with a handshake or a warm farewell, just a quiet understanding that he needed to confront his biases and embrace a new path. Back at Ascendant Air, Nia dove into the myriad responsibilities that came with publicly acknowledged leadership. She strategized expansions into new flight routes, focusing on parts of the country and the globe that were underserved. She worked to refine the traveler experience, bringing in technology that would speed up boarding and improve comfort. Most of all, she championed diversity across the airline staff, from flight crews to management. If the brand was to represent unity and inclusion, its workforce needed to reflect that principle. Meanwhile, Dean Jacobs began his mandated training. At first, he attended begrudgingly, feeling singled out for an innocent mistake. But as he listened to lectures on systemic prejudice and heard colleagues recount harrowing stories of racial profiling, something began to shift. The training forced him to examine not just the high-profile incident with Nia, but all the smaller ways he might have acted differently, issuing more warnings to certain people, being overly suspicious of others. It wasn't a comfortable process. Months passed. Nia continued to make headlines as her role in Ascendant Air reshaped the industry narrative. Most stories praised her as a self-made success who overcame countless obstacles, culminating in that viral confrontation that ironically propelled her into the public eye. She participated in press conferences, carefully steering attention not just to the incident, but to the airline's forward-thinking projects, eco-friendly fleets, scholarship programs for aspiring pilots, and cross-cultural community outreach. In a mid-year press interview, she addressed the situation openly for the first time. "We're committed to making Ascendant Air a place where everyone feels welcome. That means holding people accountable when bias rears its head. But it also means giving people space to learn and do better." Her words reached millions, sparking debates and discussions. Some supported her balanced approach, applauding her for not rushing to punish Dean. Others felt she was too lenient, arguing that high-profile offenders rarely changed. Nia herself remained unswayed by public opinion. Her own moral compass told her that transformation often resulted from empathy and dialogue, not just punishment. The police department's interim report confirmed that Officer Dean Jacobs completed every session of bias training. They also assigned him to a community outreach initiative, partnering with local nonprofits that work to improve relations between officers and residents in historically neglected neighborhoods. Dean went grudgingly at first, but the more he engaged, the more he realized how differently people experienced law enforcement. He found himself listening to personal stories of mistrust and pain, feeling an ache in his chest that was half empathy, half regret. One sweltering summer afternoon, Dean volunteered to help organize a career day at a community center near the city's south side. Children and teens would attend sessions about various professions, and the police department had a booth where youth could talk to officers, learn about safety, and see if any had interest in law enforcement careers. Near the end of the day, Dean saw Nia Brooks walk into the center, accompanied by a local official. She had donated to fund scholarships for students interested in aviation, and she was invited to speak about how they could pursue that dream. Nia paused by the police booth, recognizing Dean. He felt a jolt of nerves, but smiled tentatively, stepping forward to greet her. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, offering a handshake. "Good to see you." She returned the handshake with cautious warmth. "Officer Jacobs, I hear you've been active here." He nodded. "Yeah, I actually like it now. Meeting these kids, learning their stories. I'm not the same officer I was in that lounge. I'm trying to show them a better side of policing than I did you that day." Nia took a moment, measuring her words. "I'm glad," she finally said, sincerity in her eyes. "Real change starts when we challenge ourselves." They spoke briefly about the progress in the training programs. For the first time, Dean seemed to stand not as an adversary, but as a remorseful man striving to be better. Nia still felt the remnants of that humiliating day in the back of her mind, but seeing him contribute to the community offered a measure of resolution. Time passed, and Ascendant Air soared to new heights, both literally and figuratively. Under Nia's leadership, the airline introduced several initiatives to make first-class cabins more accessible for loyal customers of different income levels, implemented scholarships for young talent, and refined flight safety measures that included guidelines to protect travelers from discriminatory behavior. They also funded regular training for flight attendants on handling sensitive passenger disputes. If you've made it this far into the story, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to drop a like if you're enjoying it. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your feedback means the world to me, and it helps keep these stories flowing. Some months later, a local news outlet in Chicago ran a feature on Ascendant Air's community engagement programs. The segment showed footage of a new center the airline had sponsored for youth interested in STEM fields, especially those focusing on aviation technology. To everyone's surprise, Officer Dean Jacobs appeared on camera, standing alongside a small group of volunteers, helping kids assemble model airplanes. He spoke humbly about bridging gaps between law enforcement and underrepresented communities. One snippet captured Nia visiting that same program, chatting with parents and encouraging them to believe in their children's dreams. Side by side, Nia and Dean appeared, an unusual duo, forging a testament that conflicts, when met with introspection, can serve as catalysts for growth. The final stroke of karmic balance came when Dean publicly addressed the old viral footage once again, this time in a short online video message. "I've learned a lot since that incident," he said, shoulders squared but voice sincere. "I owe Ms. Brooks my respect for showing me that mistakes can lead to learning if you're willing to do the work. Profiling is never okay, and I'm committed to doing better, both as an officer and as a person." By then, public interest in the story had mostly subsided, overshadowed by new headlines. But for those who still followed it, Dean's candid message was a sign of progress. Comments under his post were mixed. Some hailed his willingness to learn, others remained skeptical. Yet if transformation is a journey, not a sprint, then at least he had begun. Meanwhile, Nia continued to push Ascendant Air forward with expansions into Asia and South America. She cultivated partnerships with eco-friendly manufacturers to reduce the airline's carbon footprint. She also introduced mentorship programs for employees hoping to advance within the company, especially individuals from marginalized backgrounds who seldom had such opportunities. Her own personal life took on a quieter shape. With her secret stake fully unveiled, she could move freely between board meetings and public events without hiding her influence. Occasionally, she'd reflect on that fateful day at Monarch International Airport, the uneasy tension in the lounge, the stares on the plane, and the unwavering sense of injustice she felt. Sometimes, the best impetus for growth is adversity. In this case, the confrontation with Dean might have been the nudge she needed to reveal her full role and expedite crucial policy reforms. At Ascendant's corporate headquarters, an executive asked Nia if she had any lingering resentment about what happened. Nia smiled thoughtfully. It wasn't a pleasant experience, she admitted, but it was a crossroads. We took that negative and turned it into a catalyst for training, for conversation, for accountability. That's more valuable than winning a lawsuit or walking away angry. And so life carried on. Nia Brooks, once a modest entrepreneur with extraordinary vision, now helped chart the skyward course of one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country. Dean Jacobs, once staunch in his prejudice, began the slow but steady process of evolving into a more conscientious officer who recognized the power of empathy. In a quiet reflection one evening, Nia recalled how, in her youth, she dreamed of traveling the world, stepping onto planes with an unshakable confidence. She had achieved that dream, and now she was doing more, ensuring that travelers of every race, gender, and background had a fair shot at occupying those seats without fear of being questioned simply for existing. If this story touched your heart or stirred your thoughts, please take a moment to drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know your reflections in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Share a piece of your own journey, and let's keep the conversation going. Every time you interact, it helps stories like this reach more people who might need them. In the end, Nia's ascent within Ascendant Air became a symbol of transformation, not only for the airline, but for every person who watched the viral video and realized that assumptions can be broken, that unconscious biases can be challenged, and that an individual's worth isn't determined by how typical they appear. Dean Jacobs' story served as a parallel lesson. The greatest growth can spring from the deepest mistakes, provided one has the humility to own them. Together, their narrative underscored a universal truth. Adversity can open our eyes and shift our perspective. Today's conflict might spark tomorrow's evolution, whether in an airport lounge or an entire industry. Though fear and prejudice remain part of society's undercurrent, the courage of people like Nia, and even the flawed redemption of individuals like Dean, proves that progress is possible. And so we close this chapter, hopeful that each and every one of us might learn to confront our own biases with humility and champion equality with unwavering determination. After all, the horizon is vast, and there's room for everyone to travel in dignity, comfort, and respect, soaring toward destinations they never thought possible.